As twilight stretched its shadows across the sleepy town, I turned my laptop on, its screen illuminating the dimly lit room. Eager to unwind, I began to browse Reddit, not knowing that tonight, my life would change forever. A thread titled "Share Your Creepiest Experience" caught my eye, pulling me in with a magnetic, almost supernatural force. I scrolled through the stories, each more bone-chilling than the last. Then, one post stopped me cold. It was written by someone who claimed they lived in my town. The details were vague, but the user described an old house at the edge of town, much like mine. Intrigued, I typed a quick reply, asking for more details. The cursor blinked mockingly, awaiting a response that would seal my fate. Hours passed with no reply, so I shut down the computer and headed to bed. As I drifted into sleep, the faintest whisper of wind seemed to murmur through the room, though every window was firmly shut. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled the blankets tighter around me, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. I awoke abruptly in the middle of the night, my room bathed in an eerie moonlight that seemed too bright, too focused. Glancing at the clock, I noted it was exactly 3:33 a.m. A sense of unease settled over me as I realized that the room was silent, too silent, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. As I lay there, trying to convince myself to go back to sleep, a sudden cold draft swept through the room. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw my computer screen light up from across the room. It was booting up on its own. Frozen in place, I watched as it flickered to life, the Reddit page still displayed. A new message notification popped up on the screen, the red icon pulsating like a warning. Compelled by a force I couldn't understand, I got out of bed and approached the computer. The message was from the same user who had posted about the old house. It read, "Why don't you come and see for yourself?" Attached was a map pinpointing a location just a few blocks from my home. Before I could process the implications, another gust of wind slammed against the window, causing it to rattle violently. I jumped back, heart racing, as a shadow seemed to pass by the glass. Peering outside, I saw nothing but the still, dark night. The trees were unmoving, the air dead calm. Torn between fear and an insatiable curiosity, I decided I had to find out if the post was just a prank or something more. Grabbing a flashlight, I dressed quickly and left the house. The streets were deserted, the silence oppressive, as if I had stepped into another dimension. The only sound was the gravel crunching under my feet. As I neared the location marked on the map, the air grew colder, the night darker. The flashlight's beam seemed to struggle against the darkness, barely penetrating the thick, unnerving blackness. When I finally reached the spot, I found myself standing in front of an old, abandoned house that seemed to groan under the weight of its own decay. The front door was slightly ajar, beckoning me inside. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the hinges squealing in protest. The air inside was stale and cold, filled with the smell of mold and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood. I shone the flashlight around, the beam flickering nervously. The house was in shambles, with peeling wallpaper and debris scattered everywhere. As I moved deeper into the house, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a child's laughter echoing through the halls, though the house was clearly long abandoned. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, and a voice whispered right into my ear, so close I could feel the breath. "You shouldn't be here," it hissed, sending shivers down my spine. I spun around, flashlight flailing wildly, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness and the lingering echo of the voice. Heart pounding, I hurried back toward the entrance, but the layout of the house seemed to have shifted, rooms and hallways distorting into a labyrinthine puzzle. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. Each turn brought me to unfamiliar territory, the house seemingly alive, changing around me. Desperate, I found a room that was less decayed than the others. Inside, a mirror hung on the wall, its surface dusty but intact. As I approached it, the air grew noticeably colder, my breath visible in the moonlight streaming through a cracked window. I wiped the mirror with my sleeve, revealing my reflection, or so I thought. In the mirror, my face was twisted in a silent scream, my eyes hollow and dark. Behind me, the reflection showed not the room I was in, but a dark, endless corridor, and standing there was a figure, shrouded in shadow, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I turned around, heart racing, but the room was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. Instead, the words "Leave now" appeared on the glass, etched from within. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran, finding my way back through the twisted hallways by sheer luck. Bursting out of the house, I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my own home. Back in my room, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for breath. My computer still on, the Reddit page glared at me accusingly. I closed the laptop with a snap, vowing never to open that thread again. But as I tried to calm my racing heart, a new dread settled over me. The house had changed me, marked me in some imperceptible way. As I lay in bed, trying to find solace in the familiar, a cold whisper brushed against my ear, "It's not over yet." I knew then that the horrors of that night were just the beginning, and that my journey into the unknown had only just begun, leaving me hanging on the edge of an abyss that beckoned with dark, unseen arms. The days following my harrowing escape from the abandoned house passed in a blur of unease and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than natural, and every whisper of the wind sounded like a faint, mocking laughter. My once peaceful home now felt like a prison, the walls closing in with every passing hour. I tried to distract myself by diving back into work, but the screen of my computer seemed to flicker with a sinister light, reminding me of that night. One evening, while trying to focus on some documents, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. At first, I dismissed it as a branch moved by the wind, but the tapping persisted, rhythmic and insistent. With a deep breath, I approached the window and pulled back the curtain. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, pale and distorted, its eyes black voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest, as the face vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The room felt colder, the air thicker, as if something had been invited in when I acknowledged the apparition. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every sound, each creak of the house a sinister whisper. The next morning, determined to rid myself of these hauntings, I visited the local library. The old librarian, Mrs. Whitaker, noticed my haggard appearance and asked if I was all right. I hesitated, then decided to confide in her about my experiences. Her face grew pale as I recounted the events, and she beckoned me to follow her to a secluded corner of the library. "There's a history in this town, dark and twisted, that few speak of," she whispered, pulling out an old, leather-bound book. "The house you describe has been abandoned for over 50 years, ever since the family that lived there vanished without a trace." She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for, a black and white photo of the house. "They say it's cursed, haunted by the black-eyed children, apparitions of those who once lived there, trapped in torment." The mention of the black-eyed children sent a chill down my spine. I had read about such entities in folklore, ghostly children with eyes as black as coal, harbingers of doom. "What do they want?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whitaker shook her head, her eyes filled with fear. "No one knows for sure, but they are often seen before disasters, or," she paused, swallowing hard, "before the death of those who see them." Determined to find a way to protect myself, I borrowed the book and several others on local legends and paranormal protection. That night, I pored over the texts, searching for anything that might help. According to one book, such spirits could be bound or banished using a ritual involving salt and iron. Armed with newfound knowledge, I bought salt and iron nails from the local hardware store. That night, I sprinkled salt around my home and placed the nails at the thresholds. It was a small comfort, but I hoped it would be enough to ward off the dark forces that seemed intent on enveloping my life. For a few nights, it seemed to work. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive feeling of being watched lessened. Just when I started to believe that I might have driven the spirits away, I received another message on Reddit. It was from the same user as before, but this time, the message was just an image, a photo of me, taken from outside my window the night I saw the face. Panic set in as I realized that not only was my home being haunted, but I was being stalked as well. The boundaries between the digital world and reality were blurring, and I felt trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Desperate, I sent a reply, demanding to know what they wanted from me. Hours passed with no response. As night fell, the atmosphere grew tense, electric with impending doom. I tried to stay awake, to keep watch, but exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. In my dreams, I walked through the abandoned house, each room filled with whispers and shadows. The black-eyed children appeared, their eyes voids that pulled at my soul. I awoke with a start to the sound of my front door creaking open. Heart racing, I grabbed the iron nails and salt, ready to confront whatever had entered. The air was icy cold, my breath forming frost before me as I walked toward the living room. There, in the moonlight, stood the children from my dream, their black eyes gleaming with malevolent light. "You invited us in," one whispered, its voice a chilling echo of my deepest fears. "Now we will never leave." As I stood there, frozen in terror, they advanced toward me, their hands reaching out as if to pull me into the darkness with them. The room spun, the walls stretching into oblivion, the floor dropping away beneath my feet. I was falling into an abyss of fear and despair, the children's laughter ringing in my ears as everything went black. As I awakened from the abyss of nightmares, my body jolted upright, soaked in cold sweat. The room was dark, eerily quiet except for my heavy breathing. My mind raced, trying to discern dream from reality. But the chilling presence I felt lurking in the shadows wasn't a figment of my imagination, it was all too real. The air felt thick, as if saturated with unspoken horrors. I reached for the light switch, fingers trembling, only to find the power dead, the room plunged into an oppressive darkness. Groping in the dark, I found my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing nothing but the familiar contours of my room. Yet, something was off. The air had a static charge, and the silence was suffocating. I strained my ears, listening for anything out of place. That's when I heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like cloth over wood, coming from the hallway. Heart pounding, I edged toward the door, flashlight poised. The sound grew louder, more urgent. As I peeked out, the hallway stretched before me, cloaked in shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. The sound stopped abruptly, as if aware of my scrutiny. I held my breath, waiting. Then, without warning, a child's giggle echoed down the hall, the sound twisted and malicious. "Come and find us," whispered a voice, as cold as the grave. With every instinct screaming at me to flee, I knew I couldn't, not yet. I needed answers. Who were these children? What did they want from me? The only clue lay in the heart of my terror, the abandoned house. I had to return, to confront this nightmare head-on. I grabbed my coat and keys, my movements mechanical, driven by a resolve forged from sheer terror. The night was unusually foggy, the moon a dim silhouette behind a veil of mist. As I drove, the streets were deserted, the fog turning my headlights into weak orbs of light that barely penetrated the darkness. Arriving at the house, the building loomed like a tombstone in the fog. The gate creaked ominously as I pushed it open. The house stared back at me, its windows dark eyes, its door a gaping mouth. I stepped inside, the air stale and cold, as if entering the lungs of a corpse. The silence was total, as though the house were holding its breath. I called out, "I know you're here. Show yourselves." My voice sounded alien in the quiet. At first, there was no response, then a slow clap echoed through the halls, mocking. Fear twisted in my gut, but I pressed on, moving deeper into the house. As I passed through the decrepit kitchen, the temperature dropped, breath visible in the air. The flashlight flickered as I entered the living room, where I first encountered the apparitions. The light steadied, and there they were, the children, their black eyes reflecting no light, their expressions empty of warmth. "Why are you haunting me?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. One stepped forward, her voice a chilling whisper. "You called us here with your fear and your curiosity. We are bound to this place, but you invited us into your world. What do you want from me?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. "To be remembered," she replied simply. "To be set free." "How? How can I help you?" The desperation in my voice was palpable. "Find our remains, bury us properly," another child said, stepping into the light. "Only then will we find peace." I nodded, understanding dawning. Where are you buried?" The children pointed together to the floor beneath us. "Below," they said in unison. Armed with a purpose, I searched the house for a way to the basement. Behind a false wall in the kitchen, I found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air grew colder as I descended, the weight of the house above me pressing down. The basement was a catacomb of sorts, with earthen walls and a damp, moldy smell. My flashlight beam settled on a small, crudely dug pit. Inside, I found bones, small, fragile, unmistakably human. A wave of sorrow washed over me, tears mingling with the cold sweat on my face. I knew what I had to do. I worked through the night, carefully collecting the remains. At dawn, I drove to the nearest church, seeking help from a hesitant but compassionate priest. We returned to the house, where he performed a blessing and helped me bury the children properly in the local cemetery under a weeping willow whose branches swayed gently as if in thanks. Driving back to the house, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks. But as I approached, I saw that the front door was ajar, swinging silently. I paused, a familiar dread creeping up my spine. The nightmare wasn't over. There was more to this than just laying the children to rest. As I stepped inside, the air shifted, and I realized the house still held secrets that were now mine to uncover. Stepping back into the old house, a sense of finality washed over me, heavy and absolute. I felt the air shift as I crossed the threshold, a palpable tension like the quiet before a storm. The house, once filled with an oppressive darkness, now seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. My footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As I ventured deeper into the interior, I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. My flashlight's beam flickered intermittently, casting long, monstrous shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Every room I passed through felt charged, as if the house itself were alive, aware of my every move. In the living room, where I had first encountered the apparitions, the air suddenly grew colder, a chill that seeped into my bones. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me. A soft, almost inaudible whisper floated through the room. "Thank you," it said, so faint I might have imagined it. But the sense of sadness that had permeated the house was lifting, replaced by a somber tranquility. Determined to uncover all the secrets the house held, I made my way to the library, where dusty tomes and scattered papers littered the floor. As I sifted through the debris, a leather-bound journal caught my eye. Its pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting elegant but faded. I leafed through it, realizing it belonged to the father of the family who had vanished all those years ago. The journal detailed his descent into madness, driven by a forbidden curiosity about the occult. He spoke of rituals and spirits, of a veil between worlds that he had recklessly thinned. It was he who had first invited the darkness into his home, a darkness that consumed his family, trapping their spirits. The final entry was a frantic plea for forgiveness, the words scrawled unevenly across the page, "May God forgive me for what I have unleashed upon my family." Armed with this new understanding, I knew what needed to be done. The house needed to be sealed, the darkness contained once and for all. I returned to the town, gathering old tomes of sacred rites and rituals along with holy water and consecrated earth. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the house, I started the ritual. I began in the basement, the site of so much sorrow, and worked my way up, chanting prayers and scattering holy water. The house seemed to fight back, the air swirling with shadows, the walls groaning in protest. But I did not waver. I could feel the weight of the darkness beginning to lift, its grip loosening. Finally, I reached the attic, the heart of the house, where the air was thick with the remnants of old magic. I could feel the eyes of the house upon me as I completed the final incantations. A scream filled the air, a sound of such despair and rage that it shook the very foundations of the house. Then, silence. I stood alone in the attic, the air suddenly clear, the oppressive presence gone. The house felt just like what it was, an old, empty building with no more shadows lurking in its corners. I walked through each room slowly, affirming to myself that it was over. The spirits were at rest, the darkness sealed away. As I left the house for the last time, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange. I locked the door behind me, the echo of the lock clicking shut sounding like a definitive end. In my car, I looked back at the house once more. It was just an ordinary house now, its windows dark, its facade peaceful in the twilight. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. The town would recover, its dark past a chapter to be closed. I knew the horrors I had witnessed would haunt me, but they would not define me. As the house faded from view, swallowed by the night, I felt a finality settle in my heart. The nightmare was over, the spirits freed, and the darkness contained. And somewhere, deep within, I found hope that light would always find a way to conquer the shadows. As the road stretched out before me, leading me away from the horrors of the past, I knew that this chapter of my life was truly ended, this story complete, with no thread left to unravel.